Father Hyacinth Destivelle was born in Paris and studied political science before serving for a year in the French military. He made his religious profession in the Dominican province of Toulouse, France in 1995, and was ordained a priest in 2001. His subsequent academic studies include what I can only call a dazzling array of academic degrees. He has a doctorate in Slavic studies from the Sorbonne, a doctorate in theology from the Institut Catholique in Paris, a doctorate in religious sciences from the Orthodox Theological Institute of Saint Serge in Paris, a PhD in philosophy from the State University of St. Petersburg in Russia, and a master's degree in political science from the Institute of Political Studies at Bordeaux. So that's quite a list. From 2010 to 2013, Father Hyacinth lived in St. Petersburg, where he served at the Catholic parish of St. Catherine of Alexandria as the local superior of the Dominican community there. From 2005 to 2010, he served as director of the Istina Center for Ecumenical Studies in Paris and as principal editor of the prestigious journal of the same name, Istina. Father Hyacinth has lived in Rome since 2013, when he took up a position in the eastern section of the Pontifical Council for Promoting Christian Unity, where he is responsible for relations with the Slavic Orthodox churches. In that capacity, he also serves as a Catholic member of the International Catholic Orthodox Dialogue, so he was present at the Chieti meeting that is being discussed in some detail at this conference. I also remember seeing a photograph of meetings between Cardinal Koch and the Russian Patriarch, with Father Hyacinth sitting next to the Cardinal, to whom he offers sage advice in his own quiet way. So please welcome Father Hyacinth Destivelle, who will speak to us about synodality and ecumenical issue.
First of all, I would like to thank the organizer for this invitation. I'm really very pleased to be here and to be among so many friends and colleagues, and I think we incarnate what Pope Francis constantly repeats about ecumenism, that ecumenism, the path of unity, is walking together, working together, and praying together. And I'm convinced it is precisely what we are now doing. And I also already conveyed to you the greetings of Cardinal Koch, but I had the opportunity to speak with him this morning, and again he asked me to convey to you again his greetings and blessings for all your work. I will speak about synodality as an ecumenical issue in three aspects. First of all, in diverse speeches of Pope Francis, in the Council of Crete, and in the Chieti document. Let his praise be heard in the assembly of the saints. St. John Chrysostom comments upon this first verse of Psalm 149 as follows. These words, he says, show the necessity of praise united to other praises, hymns rising from a choir which forms a concert. And he adds, church means both gathering, systema in Greek, and synod, synodos. The Saint Archbishop of Constantinople was doubtless unaware of the ecclesiological resonance left to posterity of his commentary on the psalm, which was almost incidental. On many recent occasions, leaders of the churches have used his expression with regard to synodality, cited by His Holiness Pope Francis in his address at the ceremony commemorating the 50th anniversary of the institution of the Synod of Bishops on October 17, 2015. The formula was, also used by His Holiness Patriarch, the Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew, as the starting point of the preludio to the Holy and Great Council of the Orthodox Church, gathered in Crete in 2016. And it was also, the same formula was at the heart of the definition of synodality in the new document adopted by the Joint International Commission for Theological Dialogue between the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church as a whole in Chieti on September 21st, 2016. The recent evocation of the formula of Chrysostom shows to what extent synodality is a current issue for our churches. This paper proposes to review through the lens of synodality the Council of Crete and the plenary session of the Commission in Chieti, two ecumenical events of the year 2016, as well as some recent declarations by Pope Francis. Synodality, or its synonym conciliarity, do not refer, as we already heard yesterday, do not only refer to the practice of assemblies of bishops in synod or council to deliberate ecclesial questions according to the principle of collegiality accentuated by the Second Vatican Council. Following to Chrysostom, synodality also refers to an intrinsic quality of the whole church, the participation of all the baptized in the life of the church, a church understood as essentially synodal. It is this wider meaning that is expressed by the Russian word sabornost, which designates both the conciliarity and the Catholicity of the Church. The purpose of this paper will be to show that synodality is not only an ecclesiological challenge internal to our churches, but also an ecumenical issue to which they are invited to find common answers. After a presentation of several speeches by Pope Francis, especially to the Synod of Bishops, I would like to show how synodality has been the guiding principle of the Council of Crete and of recent developments in the Catholic Orthodox International Theological Dialogue. The strongest statements of Pope Francis on synodality can be found in his speech of October 17, 2015, at the commemoration of the 50th anniversary of the institution of the Synod of Bishops. For him, synodality is an intrinsic quality of the Church and a requirement for ecumenism. Synodality is first and foremost an internal quality intrinsic to the Church, believing that, I quote, "The path of synodality is that which God expects from the Church of the third millennium," end of quote. Francis emphasizes that the foundation of this synodality is none other than the sensus fidei of the baptized. For him, I quote, "A synodal church is a church which listens, a mutual listening in which everyone has something to learn. The faithful people, the College of Bishops, the Bishop of Rome, all listening to each other and all listening to the Holy Spirit," end of quote. This reciprocal learning which characterizes synodality will also be, as we shall see, a characteristic of the sharing of gifts which is proper to ecumenism. For Pope Francis, who evokes the formula of Chrysostom on this subject, the hierarchical ministry can be understood and exercised only within the framework of synodality. I quote, "Synodality as a constitutive element of the Church offers us the most appropriate interpretive framework for understanding the hierarchical ministry itself. If we understand, as St. John Chrysostom says, that Church and Synod are synonymous, Inasmuch as the Church is nothing other than the journeying together, seen others, of God's flock among the path of history towards the encounter with Christ the Lord, then we understand too that within the Church no one can be raised up higher than others. On the contrary, in the Church it is necessary that each person lower himself or herself so as to serve our brothers and sisters along the way. End of quote. The Pope's speech describes three levels of synodality. The first is that of the diocese, where the diocesan synod and the various bodies of communion, such as the Council of Priests, the College of Consultors, and the Pastoral Council, must function. The second level is that of the ecclesiastical provinces and the episcopal conferences. In this respect, the Pope maintains that it would be useful, I quote, to reflect on how to achieve even more through these bodies the immediate instance of collegiality, perhaps by integrating and updating certain aspects of the ancient ecclesiastical organization, end of quote. In fact, the Pope believes that in a synodal church, I quote, "It is not advisable for the Pope to take the place of the local bishops in the discernment of every issue which arises in their territory," end of quote. In this sense, Francis considers a sound decentralization necessary. Finally, the last level is that of the universal church, where the Synod of Bishops, representing the Catholic episcopate, is, I quote, "an expression of episcopal collegiality within an entirely synodal church," end of quote. Synodality thus has repercussions for the exercise of the primacy of the Pope. Francis affirms that even in a synodal church, greater light can be shed on the exercise of the Petrine primacy. Indeed, I quote, "The Pope is not by himself above the Church, but within it as one of the baptized, and within the College of Bishops as a bishop among bishops, called at the same time as successor of Peter to lead the Church of Rome, which presides in charity over all the churches," end of quote. In his interview to the Belgian magazine Tertio on December 7, 2016, Pope Francis clarifies his synodal conception of Petrine ministry, starting from the fact that, I quote, "the Church is born from the community. It is born from the grassroots. It is born from baptism and is organized around a bishop who convokes her, gives her strength," end of quote. Francis sets a synodal church in opposition to a pyramidal church. I quote, either there is a pyramidal church where what Peter says is done, or there is a synodal church where Peter is Peter, but he accompanies the church and makes her grow. He listens to her. More than that, he learns from that and goes harmonizing, discerning what comes from the churches, and he gives it back. End of quote. Pope Francis cites as an example the experience of the process of the two synods which led to the post-synodal exhortation Amoris Laetitia. That is synodal, he says, not to go from above down, but to listen to the churches, to harmonize them, to discern. Certainly, Peter is the guarantor of the church unity, the guarantor. However, there must be progress in synodality, which is one of the things that the Orthodox have kept. End of quote. Synodality, therefore, has an internal dimension for Pope Francis, which can be defined as mutual listening. The two assemblies of the Synod of Bishops convened by him on the theme of the family in 2014 and 2015 may be considered a turning point in the contemporary history of the Catholic Church because of the synodality implemented more than for the open perspectives on the theme in question. But the synodality of the Church is also required from the ecumenical point of view, both because the Catholic Church can learn in its dialogue in truth with other Christians, and also because any synodality seen to be implemented in the Catholic Church will serve as a tangible witness for them. One of the features of synodality is, as we have seen, mutual listening, the capacity to learn from one another. But from others, surely Catholics can learn more about synodality itself. In order to define ecumenical dialogue, Pope Francis readily takes up the expression sharing of gifts, so often used by St. John Paul II. In his apostolic exhortation Evangelii Gaudium, the only example of a proposed sharing of gifts is synodality. I quote, "In the dialogue with our Orthodox brothers and sisters, we Catholics have the opportunity to learn more about the meaning of episcopal collegiality and their experience of synodality." End of quote. As early as June 28, 2013, when receiving a delegation from the Ecumenical Patriarchate, the Pope referred to the work of the Joint International Commission, hoping that it would contribute to, I quote, "the Catholic Church reflection on the meaning of episcopal collegiality and the tradition of synodality, so characteristic of the Orthodox Church," end of quote. This quotation clearly shows that for the Pope, synodality is as important for the internal life of the Catholic Church as for its relations with other Christians. This is what he explains in a particularly synthetic way when answering a question from Father Spadaro regarding synodality in the Church. I quote, "We must walk together, the people, the bishops, and the Pope. Synodality could be lived at various levels. Maybe it is time to change the methods of the Synod of Bishops, because it seems to me that the current method is not dynamic. This will also have ecumenical value, especially with our Orthodox brethren. From them, we can learn more about the meaning of episcopal collegiality and the tradition of synodality. The joint effort of reflection, looking at how the Church was governed in the early centuries, before the breakup between East and West, will be a fruit in due time. In ecumenical relations, it is important not only to know each other better, but also to recognize what the Spirit has sown in the other as a gift for us." End of quote. In his speech on the anniversary of the Synod of Bishops, the Pope emphasizes this ecumenical dimension of synodality once again. The commitment to build a synodal church, he says, has significant ecumenical implication. On this subject, he recalled his words to the delegation of the Ecumenical Patriarchate a few months earlier on June 27, 2015. The careful examination on how in the Church the principle of synodality and the service of the one who presides are articulated, he said, will make a significant contribution to the progress of relations between our churches. End of quote. The external dimension of synodality consists not only in learning from others, but also in reappraising the practice of the Catholic Church. This concerns in the first place the exercise of primacy, In his interview to the Civiltà Cattolica in August 2013, Francis affirmed that he wanted, I quote, to continue the discussion that was begun in 2007 by the Joint Commission on how to exercise the Petrine primacy. In Evangelii Gaudium, after calling for a conversion of the papacy, he recalls the wish of John Paul II expressed in Utunum Sint to find a way of exercising the primacy which is open to a new situation. Pope Francis adds, I quote, "We have made little progress in this regard. The papacy and the central structures of the Universal Church also need to hear the call to pastoral conversion," end of quote. In another interview with La Stampa, Pope Francis recalled once again the invitation of John Paul II, stressing the importance of this both for the unity of Christians and for the functioning of the Church. John Paul II spoke even more explicitly about a way of exercising the primacy which is open to a new situation, Pope Francis said, not just from the point of view of ecumenical relations, but also in terms of relation with the curia and the local churches, end of quote. Particularly interesting, finally, is the importance the Pope gives synodality for the whole of humanity. Beyond its ecclesial value, synodality can be a model of government for nations, allowing a new conception of authority. A synodal church, he says, is like a standard lifted up among the nations, says Francis in his speech on the anniversary of the Synod of Bishops. As a church with journeys together with men and women, he says, sharing the travels of history, let us cherish the dream that a rediscovery of the inviolable dignity of peoples and of the function of authority as service will also be able to help civil society to be built up in justice and fraternity, and thus bring about a more beautiful and human world for coming generations, end of quote. For Pope Francis, as we have seen, synodality is the key word for ecclesial life because it is the principle of mutual listening which should guide the Church at all levels, diocesan, regional and universal. At the same time, the Catholic Church can learn more about synodality from other churches, particularly the Orthodox churches. As well, a more effectively implemented synodality in the Catholic Church will also be a compelling sign for all our ecumenical relationships. In this respect, a renewed Catholic practice of synodality would no doubt be much more convincing for ecumenical dialogue than many documents of theological dialogue. In this sense, the assemblies of the Synod of Bishops on 2014 and 2015 could also be considered as ecumenical events. It is first of all by its reflection on itself and by its internal reform that the Catholic Church draws near to other Christians. Father Christophe Dumont, the former director of the Center Istina, pointed out in 1963, I quote, "More than all declarations of principle, the factual existence of an effective collegiality will be able to convince our Orthodox brothers to take up, alongside the Latin Church, in the Universal Church, the truly Catholic Church, the place that belongs to them," end of quote. It is interesting to reflect that at the very moment when Pope Francis revived the theme of synodality in the Catholic Church, the Orthodox Church concretized its plan for a pan-Orthodox council after several decades of preparation. The order of the day of the Holy and Great Council of the Orthodox Church did not include the question of synodality. The 6 documents on its agenda dealt respectively, as we heard yesterday, with the mission, the diaspora, autonomy of the churches, fasting, marriage, and relationship with other Christians. Yet, as we have pointed out for the Synod of Bishops of the Catholic Church, it can be said that the underlying theme of the Council of Crete, apart from the documents adopted, was synodality. And that synodality was also its principal ecumenical interest. This is what emerges in the speeches delivered by the Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew on the occasion of the Council, as well as in several passages of the conciliar documents. The theme of synodality appears in the common thread of the speeches of Patriarch Bartholomew on the occasion of the Council. As early as his encyclical for the convocation of the Council, published on March 20, 2016, Patriarch Bartholomew stressed that the main challenge was conciliarity. I quote, "Orthodoxy is the conciliar church. The foremost and most important goal of this Pan-Orthodox Council shall be to teach that the Orthodox Church is the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church united in the sacraments, especially in the Holy Eucharist, in the Orthodox faith, but also in conciliarity." End of quote. The Patriarch affirms the fact that Orthodoxy will express its conciliarity on a global level after the passing of so many centuries constitute a first and most decisive step that, by the grace of God, is expected to lead to the convening of further pan-Orthodox councils soon thereafter. End of quote. The rich proluzio which the Patriarch pronounced on the first day of the Council is almost entirely devoted to synodality, which is presented as an intrinsic dimension of the Church, and even as a dimension of the Christian faith. The Patriarch begins his speech by repeating the Chrysostom formula. I quote, "The term Church is defined as a system and synod. The synodal institution," he continues, "derives its origin from the depths of the mystery of the Church. It is not merely a matter of canonical tradition," he says, "which we have received and preserved, but a fundamental theological and doctrinal truth, without which there is no salvation. Indeed," the Patriarch says, "in confessing our faith in the Holy Creed, in the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, at the same time we proclaim our synodality, which incarnates in history all those characteristics of the mystery of the Church, that is to say, her unity, holiness, universality, and apostolicity." End of quote. Bartholomew shows that the 4 fundamental marks of the Church are closely linked to synodality. Without synodality, the unity of the Church is severed. The holiness of its member is reduced to mere individual morality. Catholicity is sacrificed in favor of particular individual or national interests, and the apostolic message fails to be proclaimed. The Patriarch goes on to outline that synodality is inseparable from the history of the Church, evoking after the Apostolic Council of Jerusalem the ancient metropolitan councils and ecumenical councils, but also in the second millennium the many Orthodox councils, such as the 14th century Palamite councils, which bear witness to the fact that, despite external difficulties, the Orthodox Church never suspended its synodal activity, even on a pan-Orthodox level. According to Patriarch Bartholomew, 4 reasons had motivated the convocation of the Council. The first of these is precisely the manifestation of synodality. Synodality constitutes an expression and demonstration of the mystery of the Church itself. Secondly, the convocation was made necessary by the development of the system of autocephaly. Indeed, I quote, while the structure is canonically and ecclesiologically correct, the danger of its conversion into a kind of federation of churches, each of which promotes its own interests and ambitions, renders necessary the application of synodality. End of quote. Thirdly, the ecumenical movement, the proclamation of autonomies, and thirdly, the Orthodoxy faces new challenges that require a common response. The diaspora, the ecumenical movement, the proclamation of autonomies and autocephaly, and so on. And ultimately, the Patriarch concludes, I quote, the significance and consequence of this council lies primarily in the very fact of its realization. By God's grace, after so many centuries, when this proved impossible, this alone would suffice for its integration within the great events of the history of the Church. End of quote. At the final session of the Council on June 25th, Patriarch Bartholomew summarized again this main achievement of the Council using the metaphor of the common path, the synhodos. Despite the imperfection of the past, he said, this Holy and Great Council provides the opportunity to revitalize the conciliar process so that the ecclesial councils become the natural and canonical way to attain and affirm Orthodox unity for all our Orthodox sister churches. End of quote. The Patriarch's homily pronounced on June 26 during the Divine Liturgy at the closing of the Council is particularly important also for it is entirely devoted to synodality. Citing several times the Orthodox American theologian of Russian origin, Father Alexander Schmemann, Patriarch Bartholomew evoked the synodal nature of the Church, defined as an ecumenical synod which God Himself summoned. If we do not understand the Church as essentially synodal, the Patriarch said, if we do not accept that the whole life of the Church is a life in synod, Bartholomew states, then we will not be able to understand correctly the function of councils in the narrower sense of this term. End of quote. The main teaching of the council, repeated by Ecumenical Patriarch, is the following. Synodality is another word to describe the unity, holiness, Catholicity and apostolic nature of the Church. In fact, the Council, I quote, has revealed that the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church united by faith, the sacraments and witness in the world incarnates and expresses authentically the central ecclesiological principle and the truth of synodality. And it has also revealed that the Church lives as a synod. End of quote. Synodality as such, as we have said, was not on the agenda of the Council. However, in addition to the 6 documents on its agenda, the 2 texts which were adopted and drafted, namely the message and the encyclical, address this theme. The message of the Council emphasizes that the conciliarity perverts her organization, the way the conciliarity of the Church perverts her organization, the way decisions are taken, and determines her path. Applied to the question of the diaspora, this principle of conciliarity provides a foundation for the regional episcopal assemblies that the Council confirmed. It is also at the source of the synaxes of the primates and of the Holy and Great Council itself, whose message evokes that it could henceforth be summoned regularly every 7 or 10 years. The encyclical of the message of the Council In its first chapter, entitled The Church, Body of Christ, Image of the Holy Trinity, affirms that the Church on herself is a council. I quote, "In her unity and Catholicity, the Orthodox Church is the Church of councils from the Apostolic Council in Jerusalem to the present day. The Church in herself is a council established by Christ and guided by the Holy Spirit." Synodality is also addressed in the 6th chapter, which is dedicated to the theme of globalization. In an original way, this chapter proposes as an alternative model the organization of the Orthodox Church. I quote, "In opposition to the leveling and impersonal standardization promoted by globalization, and also to the extremes of nationalism, the Orthodox Church proposes the protection of the identities of peoples and the strengthening of local identity. As an alternative example for the unity of mankind, the Church proposes the articulated organization of the Church on the basis of the equality of the local churches." End of quote. The idea is not unlike the model of synodality proposed to all humanity by Pope Francis at the end of his speech on October 17, 2015, as we have heard. In conclusion of this second part, it can be said that the main relevance of the Holy and Great Council for the Orthodox Church, beyond its decision, is the synodality which is intended to manifest. Synodality was also the underlying ecumenical focus, even more probably than the document concerning the relations of the Orthodox Church with the rest of the Christian world. It is striking to see how this appeal to synodality would resonate, even in the very same expressions, in the last document of the Joint International Commission for Theological Dialogue between the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church as a whole. The document adopted in Chieti on September 21st, 2016 by the Joint Commission is entitled Synodality and Primacy in the First Millennium Towards a Common Understanding in Service to the Unity of the Church. It is interesting to see how, starting from an original question regarding primacy, the theological dialogue placed synodality at the center of the discussion. It may be useful to recall the origins of this rather brief document, the sixth adopted by the Commission since its foundation in 1979. The so-called plan for embarking on theological dialogue between the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church, approved in 1980 in Patmos, Rhodes, during the first plenary session of the Commission, stressed that, I quote, "The study of the sacraments of the Church is conducive to a thorough and positive examination of the problems of the dialogue." End of quote. Such a method was innovative because, as Monsignor Paul McPatton said already yesterday, instead of starting with the point of divergence, as had been undertaken previously, the request was made to start with what we have in common, and by developing it, to touch upon from inside and progressively all the points on which we are not in agreement. This is why the first three documents of the Joint Commission dealt respectively with the relations between the Church and the Eucharist, the Church as a communion of faith and sacraments, especially the three sacraments of Christian initiation, and finally the sacrament of orders. This third document, known as the Valamo document, ended with a presentation on apostolic succession, which is inseparable from the synodality experienced at the regional level, having already cited Apostolic Canon 34, and at the universal level. And this document is this document concludes by the following sentence. I quote, "It is in this perspective of communion among local churches that the question could be addressed of primacy in the church in general and in particular the primacy of the Bishop of Rome, a question which constitutes a serious divergence among us and which will be discussed in the future," end of quote, of this Valamo document. It is interesting to see in this sentence that synodality should serve only as a perspective of a reflection on primacy. A draft text on this subject was prepared for the 1990 plenary assembly in Freising. However, as is well known, the upheavals in Central and Eastern Europe forced the Commission to address the question of unitism. It was not only Belgrade in 2006 that the Joint Commission was able to return to the agenda prepared at Valamo and study the text prepared in 1990, which would finally be adopted in Ravenna in 2007 under the title Ecclesiological and Canonical Consequences of the Sacramental Nature of the Church, Ecclesial Communion, Conciliarity and Synodality. As this title shows, the analysis of the relationship between conciliarity and primacy stemmed directly from the study of apostolic succession. The conclusion of the Ravenna document clearly indicated the resulting task of the Joint International Commission. I quote, "It remains for the question of the role of the Bishop of Rome in the communion of all the churches to be studied in greater depth. What is the specific function of the Bishop of the First See in an ecclesiology of koinonia, and in view of what we have said on conciliarity and authority in the present text? How should the teaching of the First and Second Vatican Councils on the universal primacy be understood and lived in the light of the ecclesial practice of the first millennium? These are crucial questions for our dialogue and for our hopes of restoring full communion between us." End of quote. Thus, as it is clear from both the Valamo document and the Ravenna document, the study of the relationship between primacy and conciliarity was mainly motivated by the question of primacy at the universal level, and in particular what the Bishop of Rome could exercise in a reconciled church. Yet, and this may be the surprise of this theological dialogue, it seems that the question of synodality, which may have seemed incidental at first, has gradually become an issue at least as important as that of primacy. While the Ravenna document is a rather systematic reflection, the Chieti document analyzes from an historical point of view the relations between synodality and primacy in the first millennium, a period which, as the document emphasizes, is decisive. Indeed, I quote, "Christians from East and West lived in communion during that time, and within that context, the essential structures of the church were constituted," end of quote. It is not our intention here to analyze this document in detail, but to show precisely the importance of the question of synodality in its own terms, and not merely as a perspective or as a framework of primacy. The introduction of the text evokes the origin of the Church in a Trinitarian way. The Church arises directly from the incarnation of the eternal Word of God according to the Godwill of the Father through the Holy Spirit. The Trinity is the source and the model. The unity that exists among the person of the Trinity is reflected in the communion of the member of the Church with one another. As Maxim the Confessor expresses it, the Church is an icon of the Holy Trinity. Moreover, since its origin, the one church existed as many local churches. Communion, I quote, was experienced both within each local church and in the relations between them as a unity in diversity, end of quote. The introduction then proposes a definition of synodality which is, I quote, a fundamental quality of the church as a whole. It takes up the famous expression of St. John Chrysostom, which, as we have seen, Pope Francis and Patriarch Bartholomew also used. Church means both gathering, systema, and synod, synodos. The document then analyzes the relationship between synodality and primacy at the three levels of the church, as the Ravenna document already had done. And also, as we have seen, Pope Francis in his speech of October 6, 17, 2015, local, regional, universal. At the level of the diocese, the relationship between the bishop and the community is evoked from the formula of Ignatius of Antioch, where the bishop is, there let all the people be, just as where Jesus Christ is, we have the Catholic Church, Catholici Ecclesia. The relations between the proestos and the community are reflected in the celebration of the Eucharist. I quote, "In the Eucharist, the proestos and the community are interdependent. The community cannot celebrate the Eucharist without a proestos, and the proestos in turn must celebrate with the community." End of quote. The bishop expresses synodality at two levels. First, he acts in the midst of the faithful, who are Christ's flock, as guarantor and servant of unity. Then, he represents his church to other local churches and in the communion of all the churches. At the regional level, synodality is expressed in the requirement for at least 3 bishops to take part in the ordination of a new one, through the practice of councils, the exchange of letters and visits, and so on. It is also seen by the existence of groups of dioceses in metropolitan areas. The metropolitanate was recognized in history with certain prerogatives within the framework of synodality, notably the validation of the election of a new bishop. At this regional level, the relations of correlation between primacy and conciliarity have been particularly well described by Apostolic Canon 34, already mentioned in the Valamo document, and which was at the heart of the reflection of the Ravenna document. At the universal level, the text first recalls the recognition of an order, taxis, between the 5 historical patriarchal sees. The seat of Rome occupied the first place, also the West and the East understood this primacy differently. The document also recalls the practice of the new patriarch to send letters of communion announcing his election and including a profession of faith. Such letters of communion profoundly expressed the canonical bond of communion among the patriarchs. But synodality manifested itself above all in the practice of the ecumenical councils convened to resolve the major questions of faith and canonical order in the Church. The 7th ecumenical council specified the criteria for the reception of an ecumenical council. It is provided, as Monsignor Paul already said yesterday, it provided for the agreement symphonia of the heads of the churches, the cooperation synergia of the Bishop of Rome, and finally the agreement of the other patriarch, Sophronontes. However, the text states, I quote, "Reception by the Church as a whole has always been the ultimate criterion for the ecumenicity of a council." Finally, the document recalls the practice of appeals to the major sees for disciplinary matters. For the appeals addressed to the Bishop of Rome, the Synod of Sardica 343 established a special procedure. However, these appeals were always treated in a synodical way. Indeed, the document emphasizes appeals to the Bishop of Rome from the East expressed the communion of the Church, but the Bishop of Rome did not exercise canonical authority over the churches of the East. End of quote. Metropolitan Callistus and Monsignor Paul already commented this very important sentence of this document. The document ends with a brief conclusion and an envisaged program of work in which the question of the Bishop of Rome is no longer posed as explicitly as it was at the conclusion of the Valamo document and the Ravenna document. I quote, "On the basis of this common heritage, both Orthodox and Catholics must consider how primacy, synodality, and the interrelatedness between them can be conceived and exercised today and in the future." End of quote. As pointed out above, the Commission's choice of the theme of primacy and conciliarity had as its primary objective a joint reflection on primacy at the universal level, particularly the way in which the role of the Bishop of Rome could be understood, since this was the main stumbling block between Catholics and Orthodox. Of course, the question of primacy at the universal level remains an essential perspective, but from my point of view, the Chieti document shows, above all, how primacy and synodality are interrelated, complementary, and inseparable realities. It analyzes the development in the first millennium of structures of synodality inseparably linked with primacy and in an understanding of authority as a service of love. After its initial reflection on the role of the Bishop of Rome, it would seem that the theological dialogue has brought the question of synodality to the center of the debate as an issue at least as important as that of primacy. At the end of these reflections, one can only be struck by the profound convergence of view and the similarity of terminology expressed only a few months apart. For Pope Francis, synodality is the key word of ecclesial life, as much for its own reform as for its ecumenical relations. For Patriarch Bartholomew, synodality is an intrinsic dimension of the unity, holiness, Catholicity and apostolicity of the Church, and the raison d'être of the Council of Crete. Finally, although it originally intended to reflect on primacy at the universal level, the Chieti document proposes a mainly synodal vision of the Church at its various levels based on the common experience of the first millennium. If synodality is considered in the life of its ecumenical nature, however, at the same time, we can also say that ecumenism is synodal by referring to the common etymology of the word synod. The phrase journeying together is Pope Francis' leitmotif for defining the ecumenical process, especially for relations with the Orthodox. The path of unity with the Orthodox above all means walking and working together, states Francis, who in 3 interviews tells the story where Athenagoras proposed to Pope Paul VI to walk all together and send all of the theologians to an island to discuss among themselves. The Pope's point in his emphasis on the metaphor of the journey is that unity will come to light in the midst of the journey. Unity will not come about as a miracle at the very end. Rather, unity comes about in journeying, he says. Just as Christ joined the pilgrims of Emmaus while they were on their way, Christians are called to set out on a journey until the day when they recognize in the breaking of the bread the one who died and rose for them. There is no doubt that the thanksgiving of Christians gathered around the Lord at last will confirm the accuracy of Chrysostom's commentary on Psalm 149. In the assembly of saints, which is at the same time a gathering and a synod, will endlessly resound praise united to other praises. Thank you.